The air in Ethelgard was not merely air. It was a curated atmosphere, heavy with the scent of old money, truffles, and a faint, metallic tang of ambition. It was a place where conversations were conducted in hushed tones, not out of politeness, but because secrets worth billions were exchanged over plates of seared foie gras and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. The chandeliers dripped crystal light like frozen constellations, their glow reflecting off the gold-plated cutlery and the polished surfaces of mahogany tables. The sound of the city, of New York itself, was a distant, irrelevant hum, silenced by layers of soundproofed walls and velvet drapes. Here, power was the main course, and the staff were trained to be ghosts, moving with silent efficiency, their purpose to facilitate the rituals of the elite without ever intruding upon them. They were part of the opulent decor, as functional and as invisible as the damask napkins they folded with geometric precision. To be seen, to be noticed, was a failure. It was a world built on a foundation of deliberate, cultivated ignorance of the people who served it. Alara Vance had perfected the art of invisibility. Her movements were a study in fluid economy, a ballet of practiced subservience. She navigated the narrow spaces between tables with a grace that belied the ache in her feet and the crushing weight of her reality. Her uniform, a simple but impeccably tailored black dress with a starched white apron, was a cloak that erased her identity, transforming her from a person into a function. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, tight bun, a style that offered no hint of the brilliant, restless mind it contained. She kept her eyes lowered, her gaze fixed on the task at hand, refilling a water glass, clearing a plate, presenting a wine list. This disciplined focus was her shield. It protected her from the casual cruelties and the thoughtless condescension of the patrons, but more importantly, it helped her suppress the woman she used to be, the star of Georgetown law, the prodigy who could recite obscure legal precedents as easily as others recited poetry, the daughter whose world had been shattered by the very kind of men she now served. Each clink of silver on porcelain, each burst of self-satisfied laughter was a painful echo of a life stolen from her. As she poured shimmering, chilled water into a delicate crystal goblet, the light refracting through the glass would momentarily transport her. She wasn't in Ethelgard, she was in her father's workshop, a place that smelled of solder, hot electronics, and boundless potential. She saw his hands, gentle and calloused, carefully assembling the prototypes that were the heart of Vance Innovations. He believed in building things, in creating value, not just shuffling assets. The memory was so vivid she could almost feel the warmth of his smile, a warmth now extinguished, replaced by the vacant stare and the slack mouth of a man felled by a catastrophic stroke. The predatory hostile takeover, a masterpiece of morally bankrupt but technically legal maneuvers, hadn't just bankrupted him, it had broken his spirit, and his body had followed. Now every dollar she earned in this gilded cage went to maintaining his dignity in a private care facility that cost $15,000 a month, a fortress of antiseptic quiet where he was kept comfortable but could no longer recognize her. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The subtle shift in the restaurant's atmosphere was palpable, like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. It signaled the arrival of Julian Sterling. He didn't just enter a room, he conquered it. He was a young man sculpted by privilege, his features sharp and handsome, his suit, a razor-sharp armor of Italian silk that probably cost more than Alara made in 6 months. He moved with a predatory confidence, his expensive leather shoes striking the marble floor with arrogant clicks that demanded attention. Behind him, moving with a quiet gravity that seemed to disapprove of his grandson's every step, was Arthur Sterling. The patriarch of Sterling Industries was a relic from another era, a man whose face was a roadmap of shrewd decisions and hard-won battles, whose eyes held a weary intelligence that missed nothing. While Julian scanned the room as if assessing properties to acquire, Arthur's gaze was more thoughtful, taking in the details with the quiet appraisal of a master craftsman. Elara approached their designated table, her body tensing instinctively. Serving Julian Sterling was always an exercise in self-control. He had a unique talent for making service staff feel less than human, speaking over them, through them, as if they were inconvenient pieces of furniture. True to form, he didn't acknowledge her presence as she placed the menus on the table, already deep in a condescending lecture aimed at his grandfather. Arthur, however, met her eyes for a fleeting moment, offering a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, a small gesture of courtesy that Julian would have considered a waste of energy. The contrast between the two men was a chasm. One represented a legacy built with a semblance of honor, the other, a future where that legacy would be stripped for parts and sold to the highest bidder, with no regard for the human cost. Julian leaned back in his chair, a smug smirk playing on his lips as he launched into a boastful monologue about his latest planned acquisition. He was performing for his grandfather, a peacock displaying his brightly colored, ruthless feathers. His voice, sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the restaurant's carefully maintained hush. He spoke of leverage, of hostile bids, and of strategic asset stripping, peppering his speech with a clumsy assortment of corporate jargon and Latin phrases. He spoke of a poison pill defense, with the swagger of a general discussing a battle plan, and of challenging a board's decision on the grounds of it being tultra vires. It was clear to Elara, whose mind was a library of such terms, that he was using them as weapons of intimidation, brandishing his supposed intellectual superiority without a true grasp of the nuances behind the words. He was a child playing with his father's loaded gun, dangerously unaware of its true power. The moment of impact came with a casual, devastating cruelty. As Elara moved silently to refill his water glass, Julian gestured toward her with a flick of his wrist, a dismissive wave meant to encompass all the little people of the world. He didn't even look at her, keeping his mocking gaze fixed on his grandfather. The smirk on his face widened as he delivered the line he thought was so clever, a final, triumphant jab at the old man's ethics. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's not like the help understands tultravirus or the nuances of a poison pill defense." The words hung in the air, a cloud of toxic arrogance. To Julian, she was nothing, a non-entity, incapable of thought or comprehension. He had used her as a prop in his pathetic psychodrama, reducing her existence to a punchline in his argument against his grandfather's outdated sense of decency. For Elara, the world went silent. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversations, faded into a dull, distant roar. The only sound she could hear was the steady, rhythmic pour of water from the silver pitcher into Julian Sterling's glass. In that moment, the insult did not just sting. It acted as a key, unlocking a part of her she had kept chained in the deepest dungeon of her soul for years. An arctic stillness settled over her. Her hand, the one holding the heavy pitcher, did not tremble. It became as steady as granite. The image of her father, slumped in his wheelchair, his eyes vacant, flashed behind her eyelids. This voice, this smug, dismissive tone, this was the sound of the axe that had felled her family's tree. A cold, clarifying fury, sharp and pure as a shard of ice, solidified in her veins. It wasn't a hot, blinding rage, but something far more dangerous, a calm, absolute, and righteous certainty. She finished pouring the water, every movement deliberate and measured. She placed the silver pitcher back on her tray. Then, she set the crystal goblet down on the white linen tablecloth. The small, soft click of glass on fabric sounded like a thunderclap in the sudden, tense silence that had enveloped the table. She straightened her spine, not with the deference of a waitress, but with the authority of a barrister about to address the court. She did not walk away. She stood her ground, her body perfectly still, her presence suddenly immense, undeniable. Her gaze, which had been dutifully lowered for hours, lifted. It was not defiant, not yet. It was calm, analytical, and utterly focused. Arthur Sterling, the old patriarch, leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes narrowed, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere. Julian, however, was still basking in the glow of his own perceived wit, completely oblivious that his world was about to be dismantled by the invisible woman standing beside him. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was a soft, precisely modulated sound, barely rising above the hushed ambiance of the restaurant, yet it cut through the air with the chilling efficiency of a surgeon's scalpel. It was a voice that did not belong to a waitress. It belonged to a courtroom, to a lecture hall, to a boardroom where fortunes were decided. She looked directly at Julian Sterling, her gaze unblinking, and the years of practiced subservience melted away like a phantom cloak. The woman standing there was no longer a ghost in a black uniform. She was a presence, formidable and absolute. For a moment she did not speak, allowing the weight of her sudden defiant stillness to settle over the table, drawing the attention of not only the two men, but also the occupants of the neighboring tables, who sensed a disturbance in the carefully ordered universe of Æthelgard. Julian's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confused irritation, the look of a king whose loyal subject had suddenly forgotten how to kneel. He was about to make another dismissive comment, to wave her away, but the words died in his throat as she began to speak, her first sentence landing with the force of a perfectly thrown stone into a still pond. She began by correcting him. It was a simple, academic correction, delivered with an unnerving calm that was far more intimidating than any shout could ever be. "You've slightly misused the term ultra-vires," she stated, her tone even and devoid of emotion. "It doesn't refer to a general overstepping of ethical bounds, but specifically to an act undertaken by a corporation that is beyond the scope of its legal authority, as defined by its charter." She then cited from memory the landmark 19th-century English case of *Ashbury Railway Carriage and Iron Company Limited versus Reach, explaining its nuances and its modern applications under Delaware corporate law with a fluency that was both breathtaking and terrifying. It was a flawless, impromptu legal lecture delivered over a half-eaten plate of seared scallops. The air grew thick, with a stunned, palpable silence. Julian Sterling's face, which had been a mask of smug superiority just moments before, began to crumble. A faint, reddish blotch appeared on his neck, a telltale sign of his rising panic and humiliation. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a fish gasping for air in a world that had suddenly lost all its oxygen. Arthur Sterling, the old patriarch, leaned forward, his elbows resting on the pristine white tablecloth. His weary eyes were now alight with a sharp, piercing intelligence. He watched Ilara not as an employee, but as a peer, a formidable intellect revealing itself in the most unexpected of circumstances. He had spent a lifetime reading men, assessing their strengths and weaknesses in a single handshake, a single turn of phrase. What he was witnessing now was something far beyond his experience. He saw past the waitress uniform, past the severe bun and the tired lines around her eyes, and recognized the unmistakable fire of a brilliant mind, a mind that had been tempered in a crucible of hardship he could only begin to imagine. He glanced at his grandson, at the pathetic, sputtering rage that was beginning to replace his shock, and a look of profound, weary disappointment settled upon his features. He had long suspected the boy was a hollow vessel, all swagger and no substance, and here, in the gilded cage of Æthelgard, was the irrefutable, humiliating proof. Ilara did not stop with the correction. That was merely the opening salvo, the precise, calculated shot across the bow. Now she began to dismantle him. She turned her attention to the quote 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 quote. A poison pill, she explained, her voice still unnervingly calm, is a defensive tactic utilized by a target company to prevent or discourage a hostile takeover. It is not, as you implied, a tool for the acquirer. To use it in the manner you described would not only be nonsensical, it would be a flagrant breach of fiduciary duty to your own shareholders, a clear violation of the duty of loyalty established in cases like Guth versus Loft. Her encyclopedic knowledge was a weapon, and she wielded it with devastating precision. She was not just reciting facts, she was weaving a legal narrative, constructing a case against him right there at the table, using his own boastful words as the primary evidence. Each point she made was another nail in the coffin of his credibility, another layer of his arrogant facade stripped away for all to see. The restaurant had become a theater. Diners at nearby tables had abandoned all pretense of their own conversations. Forks hovered mid-air. Wine glasses were held, forgotten, in suspended hands. The staff, her colleagues, stood frozen in the shadows along the walls, watching with a mixture of terror and awe as one of their own rose up to challenge a titan. They had all suffered Julian Sterling's casual cruelties, his sneering condescension, his utter refusal to see them as human beings. And now, this quiet, unassuming woman, who had worked beside them for years, was methodically and publicly dissecting him, using a language of power they did not understand, but whose effect was undeniably clear. It was a rebellion, a revolution of one, happening in the heart of the empire. The manager, a man named Dubois, who prided himself on his ability to handle any crisis with unflappable grace, hovered near the kitchen door, his face pale, his mind racing, utterly paralyzed by the unprecedented scene unfolding before him. Now she addressed the core of his plan, the predatory acquisition he had been boasting about. She laid out, with the clarity of a seasoned prosecutor, how his proposed strategy constituted textbook securities fraud. She spoke of pump-and-dump schemes, of artificially inflating a target's stock value through misleading press releases before shorting it, of the specific markers the SEC looks for in cases of market manipulation. She referenced specific statutes, subsections of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, her memory a flawless archive of corporate law. "Your strategy," she concluded, her voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper that forced everyone to lean in, "is not a brilliant coup. It is a clumsy, transparent, and profoundly illegal scheme that would unravel under the slightest scrutiny from any competent regulatory body. The potential penalties would not just be financial, they would be criminal." She held his gaze, and for the first time Julian Sterling looked away, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route from the prison of his own making. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all other sound. In that moment, Ilara felt a surge of something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. It was not triumph, not yet, it was reclamation. For 3 years she had been a ghost, a function, a pair of hands. She had silenced the brightest parts of herself, burying her intellect, her training, her very identity beneath layers of grief and duty. The insult from Julian had not just been about her intelligence, it had been a denial of her entire existence, of the sacrifice she had made for her father. And now that buried self had risen, not in a torrent of rage, but in a flood of cold, hard, undeniable fact. She felt the blood singing in her veins, a feeling of clarity and purpose so intense it was almost painful. She had found her voice again, and she had discovered, to her own astonishment, that it was more powerful than she had ever remembered. Julian's face was a grotesque mask of fury. The blood had rushed back to his cheeks, turning them a blotchy, furious red. The illusion of the sophisticated corporate raider had been shattered, revealing the spoiled, insecure child beneath. His voice, when he finally found it, was not the commanding baritone of a man of power, but a shrill, cracking shriek that echoed through the silent dining room. "You're fired!" he screamed, the words tearing from his throat, raw and uncontrolled. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware and causing water to slosh from the glasses. "You are fired! Do you hear me? Get out!" He pointed a trembling finger at her, his whole body shaking with a rage born of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He had been exposed, shown to be a fraud in front of his grandfather, in front of his peers, by a waitress. It was an indignity his fragile ego could not possibly withstand. He bellowed for the manager, his voice cracking with adolescent fury. "Dubois, get this thing out of my sight. Get her out of here now." He shoved his chair back, its legs scraping violently against the marble floor. He was creating a scene, a vulgar display of power that only served to deepen his own disgrace. He was trying to reassert his dominance, to use his wealth and status as a blunt instrument to erase the woman who had so effortlessly unmade him. But it was too late. The damage was done. Everyone in the room had seen him for what he was, a shallow pretender, a peacock stripped of its feathers. His tantrum was not a show of strength, but the desperate flailing of a man who had been intellectually and morally defeated. Arthur Sterling watched the meltdown with a stony, impassive expression, his disappointment hardening into something colder, something that looked terrifyingly like final judgment. The manager, Mr. Dubois, scurried forward, his face a mask of professional panic. He was caught in an impossible position, trapped between the fury of a powerful, vindictive client and the undeniable spectacle of what had just transpired. He approached Elara, his eyes pleading with her to simply disappear, to de-escalate the situation. "Miss," he began, his voice a strained whisper, "perhaps it would be best if you came with me." Elara looked at the terrified man and felt a surprising wave of pity for him. He was just another cog in this gilded machine, a man whose livelihood depended on placating the whims of entitled children like Julian. She gave a single sharp nod. There was nothing left to say. She had already said everything that mattered. She felt a strange sense of detachment as she turned to leave, the job she had clung to for 3 years, the lifeline that paid for her father's care, now severed in an instant. But there was no fear, only a cold, clear sense of finality. As she turned, Julian, still ranting, trying to justify his rage to his silent, stone-faced grandfather, made his final, fatal error. He was grasping for any semblance of his former authority, trying to rebuild the edifice of his own greatness. "I built my reputation doing this." He spat, his words aimed at Arthur, but loud enough for the entire room to hear. "My very first big win, the deal that put me on the map, was taking down a pathetic little company called Vance Innovations. It was a brilliant surgical strike." The name struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. Vance Innovations. Her father's company, her father's life's work. The source of all her family's pain, spoken aloud as a trophy by the very man who had destroyed it. The air rushed from her lungs. The professional composure she had so carefully maintained, the icy calm of the legal expert, shattered into a million pieces. A sound escaped her lips, a small, choked gasp of pure, unadulterated pain. The strength drained from her legs, and she momentarily swayed, her hand reaching out to steady herself on the back of a nearby chair. The legal deconstruction had been a performance of intellect. This was different. This was a wound, torn open and salted in the most public and cruel way imaginable. Tears, hot and immediate, welled in her eyes, blurring the opulent room into a swirl of gold and crystal. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart crumbled to dust. In that moment, she was no longer a legal prodigy or a defiant waitress. She was just a daughter, confronted with the casual, boastful cruelty of the man who had broken her father's spirit and stolen her future. The fury she had felt before was a pale shadow compared to the Arctic rage that now flooded her soul, a rage so profound it felt like grief. Arthur Sterling missed nothing. He had been watching Elara with an intensity that bordered on forensic. He saw the way she had corrected his grandson with the precision of a scholar. And now he saw this. He saw the name Vance Innovations act like a key, unlocking a depth of pain in her that was visceral and real. He saw the professional mask dissolve, revealing a raw, wounded humanity. He was a man who understood cause and effect, who had built an empire on seeing the connections others missed. He connected the name, her immediate, devastating reaction, and the legal brilliance she had just displayed. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know he was solving clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This was not a random encounter. This was not a simple case of an employee standing up to a rude customer. This was a reckoning. The confrontation that was to come would not be about legal statutes or corporate charters. It had become something far more elemental. Arthur's gaze shifted from Alara's tear-streaked face to his grandson's, which was still twisted in a sneer of self-justification. For the first time, Arthur saw not just a failure of character in Julian, but a true and profound ugliness, a moral rot that went to the very core of his being. He had not just outmaneuvered a business rival. He had reveled in the destruction of a man, and was now boasting about it years later, completely oblivious to the human wreckage he had left in his wake. The old man's expression hardened, the lines on his face deepening like cracks in granite. He raised a single, steady hand, a gesture that instantly silenced his grandson's pathetic tirade, and commanded the absolute attention of the entire room. The real trial was about to begin. Alara, guided by the now silent Mr. Dubois, walked away from the table. Each step felt like it was taken through deep water. The stares of the other patrons felt like physical touches on her skin. She did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the door to the staff area, the portal that would lead her out of this world and into the terrifying uncertainty of unemployment. The sounds of the restaurant seemed to come from a great distance, muffled and distorted, as if she were listening to them from underwater. The only thing that was real was the name, Vance Innovations, echoing in her mind like a funeral bell. It was the name of her father's dream, the name of her lost inheritance, the name of her family's tragedy, and it had been spit from the mouth of Julian Sterling like a piece of garbage. The injustice of it all was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She reached the swinging doors of the kitchen and pushed through, leaving the gilded theater of the dining room behind. The atmosphere changed instantly. The hushed quiet was replaced by the controlled chaos of a working kitchen, the clang of pots, the hiss of the grill, the sharp calls of the chefs. It was a world of work, of tangible effort, a world away from the abstract power games played just beyond the doors. She navigated the familiar maze of stainless steel counters and hurried staff, her colleagues parting to let her pass, their faces a mixture of sympathy and fear. No one said a word. They knew she was leaving for good. They had all seen it, had all borne witness to the moment the ghost in the uniform had decided to become a person. And they knew that in a place like Ethelgard, such a transformation was an unforgivable sin. In the cramped, windowless locker room, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The room smelled of bleach, old coffee, and the faint, lingering scent of desperation. It was a stark, utilitarian space that stood in brutal contrast to the opulence she had just left. She sat on the hard wooden bench in front of her narrow metal locker, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally draining away, leaving a hollow, trembling exhaustion in its place. She was jobless. The $15,000 she needed for her father's care facility, a sum that had been a mountain before, now seemed like an impassable celestial peak. For a brief, terrifying moment, despair washed over her, cold and suffocating. Had she thrown away her father's only safety net for a single moment of righteous defiance? The thought was a shard of ice in her gut, but then another feeling began to surface, pushing through the cold dread. It was the memory of Julian Sterling's face as he boasted about destroying Vance Innovations. The image ignited a fire within her, a slow-burning, incandescent rage that cauterized the wound of her despair. The fight for her father's care had always been a defensive battle, a desperate struggle for survival. Now it had transformed. It was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. The enemy, who had for years been a faceless, abstract force of corporate greed, now had a name and a face. Julian Sterling. He had given her a target. He had given her a cause. The fear did not vanish, but it was overshadowed by a new, unshakable resolve. She was not a victim. She was a weapon that had been dormant for too long, and he had just foolishly awakened it. With methodical, deliberate movements, she began to change. She unfastened the starched white apron, the symbol of her servitude, and folded it neatly, placing it on the bench. She unbuttoned the simple black dress, the uniform of her invisibility, and let it fall. As she pulled on her own clothes, a pair of worn jeans and a simple gray sweater, it felt like she was donning armor. She was shedding the skin of Ilara Vance the waitress, and stepping back into the identity of Ilara Vance the legal scholar, the fighter, the daughter of a man who deserved justice. The transformation was not just external, it was a profound internal shift, a reclaiming of her own power. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror on the back of the locker door and saw not a defeated, fired waitress, but a woman preparing for war. She walked out of the service entrance and into the cool, electric air of the New York City night. The sounds of the city, once a distant hum, now felt vibrant and alive, a symphony of possibilities. The towering skyscrapers, their lights glittering like a billion watchful eyes, no longer seemed intimidating. They seemed like a challenge. She had been living her life in the shadows, moving through the world unseen and unheard. That life was over. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and monumental obstacles, but for the first time in 3 years, it was a path of her own choosing. She felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of freedom. She had lost a job, but she had regained herself. And with that self came a formidable arsenal of knowledge, a brilliant legal mind that had been honed at one of the finest law schools in the country. Her mind, now clear and focused, began to work, piecing together a strategy. She could not fight a man like Julian Sterling alone. He was insulated by layers of wealth, power, and high-priced lawyers. She needed an ally, someone who understood the world she was about to enter, someone who could guide her. A face from her past surfaced in her memory, a beacon of integrity in a world of moral compromise, Professor Alistair Finch. Her mentor at Georgetown Law, a man who taught corporate ethics not as a theoretical concept, but as a sacred duty. He had been her fiercest advocate, the one who had told her that her mind was a rare and powerful instrument, and that she had a responsibility to use it for good. She had not spoken to him since her father's collapse, too ashamed of her abandoned career to reach out. But now, his wisdom was the only thing she could think of. She pulled out her phone, its screen a spiderweb of cracks from a dozen falls. Her fingers, trembling slightly, scrolled through her contacts until she found his name, a relic from a life she thought was lost forever. Professor Finch. She stared at the name, a wave of nostalgia and apprehension washing over her. Would he even remember her? Would he help her? She had to take the chance. He was more than just a legal expert. He was a man of profound moral conviction. He had spent his life fighting the kind of corporate predation that Julian Sterling embodied. If anyone would understand her fight, it would be him. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she pressed the call button, the cool glass of the phone feeling like a lifeline against her cheek. The phone rang once, twice, each electronic tone stretching into an eternity. She rehearsed the words in her head, trying to find the right way to explain the impossible situation she found herself in. How could she convey the enormity of what had happened, the collision of her past and present, in a Michelin-starred restaurant? How could she ask him to help her take on a multi-billion-dollar dynasty? The question swirled in her mind, a vortex of doubt. But beneath the doubt was that bedrock of resolve, the cold, hard certainty that this was a fight she had to see through to the end, no matter the cost. This was not for her. This was for her father. This was for the name Vance Innovations, and for the man who had poured his soul into it. Then, the ringing stopped. A voice on the other end of the line, older and a little gravelly, but still filled with the familiar, thoughtful cadence she remembered so well, answered. Alistair Finch. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She closed her eyes, picturing his office, filled with towering stacks of books, and the smell of old paper and justice. She opened her mouth to speak, and the voice that emerged was not the timid, deferential tone of a waitress. It was the clear, steady voice of a woman who had found her purpose, a woman who was done being invisible. Professor Finch, she said, her words cutting through the noise of the city street. "It's Ilara Vance. I know it's been a long time, but I need your help. I found him. I found the man who destroyed my father, and I'm going to take him down." The decision had been made, the first shot fired in a war that had been undeclared for 3 long years. As she stood on that busy Manhattan sidewalk, the city lights reflecting in her determined eyes, Ilara Vance was no longer running from her past. She was turning to face it, armed with a righteous fury and a brilliant legal mind. She had been a ghost for too long, a silent witness to the injustices of a world that valued wealth over worth. Now she was about to become a reckoning. The initial shock of her firing had completely subsided, replaced by a singular, all-consuming focus. The path forward was no longer about mere survival or paying the next bill for her father's care. It had become a crusade for justice, a mission to dismantle the empire of the man who had so carelessly and cruelly shattered her family. She knew the fight would be monumental, a true David and Goliath struggle against a foe with seemingly limitless resources. Julian Sterling was protected by a fortress of corporate lawyers, public relations firms, and the immense power that the Sterling name commanded. To challenge him would be to invite scrutiny, threats, and attempts to discredit her at every turn. They would dig into her past, her reasons for leaving law school, her current financial precarity, and use it all against her. They would paint her as a disgruntled, opportunistic employee seeking a payday. She understood the brutal mechanics of such a fight, the way power protects itself by crushing those who dare to challenge it. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it only hardened her resolve. Professor Alistair Finch's office was not merely a room in a university, it was a sanctuary dedicated to the abstract concept of justice. It smelled of aging paper, worn leather, and the faint, citrusy aroma of the Earl Grey tea he perpetually brewed. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through a tall, arched window, illuminating towering shelves crammed with legal texts, their spines a chaotic mosaic of faded gold lettering. It was a world away from the cold, calculated opulence of Ethelgard, a place where ideas were the currency and integrity was the only asset that mattered. Ilara sat in one of the deep, cracked leather armchairs across from his immense oak desk, a steaming mug of tea warming her trembling hands. She had recounted the entire story, her voice low and steady, but the tremor in her fingers betrayed the storm raging within her. The initial, incandescent fury had cooled into a hard, dense core of purpose, but the vulnerability of her position, the sheer scale of the mountain she proposed to climb, was a chilling weight in the pit of her stomach. She felt like a refugee who had stumbled out of a war zone and into a place of quiet, scholarly peace, almost afraid that her own turmoil would shatter the fragile tranquility of the room. Professor Finch listened without interruption, his steepled fingers resting against his lips, his sharp, intelligent eyes fixed on her face. He was an older man, with a wild mane of silver hair and a face etched with the lines of 1,000 intellectual battles. As she spoke, she saw a succession of emotions flicker in his gaze. First, a deep, paternal sorrow for the brilliant student whose light had been so cruelly extinguished. Then, a familiar, academic anger at the flagrant perversion of the law he held so sacred. And finally, as she detailed her plan, a slow, dawning look of profound respect. When she finished, the silence in the room was heavy with unspoken history, with the ghosts of her abandoned future and her father's stolen past. He did not offer platitudes or express doubt. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. He saw not the fired waitress, but the legal warrior he had always known she was. "What you are proposing," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble, "is not just a legal challenge. It is an act of war against an empire. They will not fight fair. They will try to bury you." He pushed himself up from his chair and began to pace in front of the window, his figure silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. His movements were slow and deliberate, the gait of a man accustomed to thinking through every possible angle of a complex problem. He spoke of the Sterling family's legal team, a veritable army of the most ruthless and expensive lawyers money could buy. He warned her of the public relations machinery they would deploy, a sophisticated apparatus designed to shred her credibility, to paint her as unstable, vengeful, a gold digger. He explained how they would use her 3 years of working service jobs, her departure from Georgetown, the very sacrifices she had made for her father, as weapons to portray her as a failure with a grudge. Every word was a dose of cold, hard reality, a necessary antidote to any naive hope that this would be a simple fight between right and wrong. He was testing her, ensuring she understood the full, brutal cost of the path she was choosing. He needed to know that her resolve was forged in steel, not just fleeting anger. Ilara met his warnings with an unshakable calm. Her hands were steady now, the warmth from the teacup having seeped into her bones. She looked at the man who had once been her mentor and saw the ally she desperately needed. She understood the risks. She had lived in the shadow of the Sterling Empire for 3 years, feeling its immense, indifferent weight every single day. The fear was a known quantity, an old companion. But the alternative, to walk away, to let Julian Sterling's boastful cruelty be the final word on her father's legacy, was an impossibility. It would be a betrayal of everything her father had been, and everything she was meant to be. "I know," she replied, her voice clear and strong. "They will try to destroy me. But they don't know me. They see a waitress. They don't see my father's daughter. And they have no idea what I am capable of." Her words hung in the air, a simple, powerful declaration of intent. It was in that moment that Professor Finch stopped pacing. He turned to face her, and a slow, grim smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a general who had just found his most valuable field commander. The strategy session that followed was a whirlwind of intellectual energy. Professor Finch cleared a space on his cluttered desk, and for the next several hours, the two of them mapped out their attack. It was a symphony of two brilliant legal minds working in perfect harmony. Ilara's raw, first-hand knowledge of the pain inflicted by Sterling's scheme was now combined with Finch's decades of strategic experience. They understood that a conventional lawsuit was out of the question. It would be a war of attrition, a battle of motions and depositions that Sterling's lawyers could drag out for years, bleeding her dry of resources and resolve. They needed something faster, more surgical, a single, undeniable blow that would dismantle Julian Sterling's reputation and power structure in one fell swoop. They needed irrefutable proof, a smoking gun that would transform a civil dispute over a business deal into a criminal case of conspiracy and fraud. The target, they agreed, was not the takeover itself, which had been cleverly structured to remain in a legal gray area, but the intent behind it. Ilara's mind, sharp and clear after years of disuse, began to work with astonishing speed. She recalled the vague details her father had mentioned in the early days of the takeover. Whispers of undervalued asset assessments and unusually aggressive accounting practices. The key, she realized, lay with the firm that had handled the due diligence for Sterling's acquisition, a mid-tier, notoriously ambitious accounting firm named Crestview Financial. They were the ones who had signed off on the valuation of Vance Innovations, the ones who had rubber-stamped the numbers that declared her father's life's work to be worth a fraction of its true value. If Julian had committed fraud, he could not have done it alone. He would have needed accomplices, people willing to bend the rules, to cook the books, for a substantial payday. Crestview Financial was the weak link in the chain, the place where the crime had been codified into spreadsheets and official reports. That was where they would find their proof. Their first move was to probe the public record. Ilara spent 2 days in the dusty archives of the New York Public Library's business section and countless hours navigating arcane online databases, searching for the official filings related to the Vance Innovations acquisition. What she found was a wall of deliberate obfuscation. Key documents were heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out with the justification of proprietary business information. Other files were sealed by court orders obtained under dubious pretenses. It was a digital fortress, a carefully constructed maze designed to protect the secrets of the deal. It was clear that Julian, or more likely his lawyers, had taken great pains to bury the details of his, quote, first big win. This initial dead end, which would have discouraged most, only fueled Alara's determination. The more effort they had put into hiding the truth, the more damning that truth must be. It was a confirmation that she was on the right path. Professor Finch, seeing the official channels were a dead end, decided it was time to leverage his most valuable asset, his network. He had spent 40 years teaching and consulting, and in that time, he had cultivated a vast web of former students, colleagues, and contacts throughout the legal and financial worlds. He made a series of discreet phone calls, speaking in careful, coded language, calling in favors that had been owed for years. After a day of quiet inquiries, he found a lead. A former student of his, now a partner at a rival firm, knew someone who had worked at Crestview Financial during the time of the Vance takeover. The man's name was Marcus Thorne, a junior accountant back then, who had reportedly left the firm under a cloud of disillusionment a year after the deal was finalized. He was their potential insider, the ghost in the machine who might be willing to talk. The meeting with Marcus Thorne was arranged to take place in a noisy, anonymous coffee shop in Queens, far from the prying eyes of Manhattan's financial district. Alara went alone. Finch had insisted on it, arguing that a one-on-one conversation would be less intimidating. Marcus was a nervous, bird-like man in his late 30s, with tired eyes that darted around the room as if expecting to be ambushed at any moment. He clutched his coffee cup with both hands, a fortress against the world. Alara approached him not as a lawyer, but as a fellow human being. She didn't start with accusations or legal threats. She started with her father. She told Marcus about Vance Innovations, not as a corporate entity, but as her father's dream. She described the workshop, the smell of solder, the passion in his eyes. She spoke of the man he was before the stroke, and the shell he had become. Her story was not a tactic. It was the raw, unvarnished truth, and its power was undeniable. As she spoke, she saw the walls of fear and cynicism around Marcus begin to crumble. He had been a 24-year-old kid when the Vance deal came across his desk, eager to please and desperate to climb the corporate ladder. He confessed that he and others in his department had known the numbers were wrong. They had been pressured from the top, by the firm's senior partners, and by a relentless, arrogant young investor named Julian Sterling, to devalue Vance's intellectual property portfolio, to treat patents for groundbreaking technology as little more than worthless paper. The guilt from that deal had eaten at him for years, a moral poison that had eventually driven him out of the corporate world altogether. He had seen firsthand how the system was rigged, how men like Julian Sterling could destroy lives with the stroke of a pen and call it good business. He looked at Alara, at the quiet dignity in her grief, and made a decision. He told her he couldn't access the files directly. He had been locked out of the Crestview systems for years. But he knew their protocols. He knew their weaknesses. He told her about the firm's archaic digital archiving system, a relic from the early 2000s that was notoriously insecure. And he knew that once a month, on a Sunday morning between 3 and 5 a.m., the IT department ran a full system migration, a process during which the primary security firewalls were temporarily lowered to allow for the data transfer. During that 2-hour window, a skilled operator with the right legacy credentials could potentially access the deep archives. He still had his old login credentials memorized, a string of characters he had never been able to forget. He couldn't go in himself, but he could give her the key. It was a massive risk for him, a potential felony, but in her eyes, he saw a chance for a redemption he had long since given up on. The following Sunday morning found Alara not in a high-tech command center but in a cramped, stuffy room at a pay-by-the-hour motel near LaGuardia Airport, chosen for its anonymous, untraceable Wi-Fi. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a smell she would forever associate with the nervous, thrilling terror of this moment. On a rickety table, her second-hand laptop, its screen a patchwork of cracks, was her only weapon. Professor Finch was on the phone, his calm, steady voice a lifeline in the tense darkness. At precisely 3 a.m., she took a deep breath and began. The screen filled with the blocky, dated interface of the Crestview archive system. Using Marcus's credentials, she slipped past the outer layer of security. Now she was in the maze, a digital labyrinth of nested folders and nonsensically named subdirectories, a decade's worth of corporate secrets deliberately designed to be unnavigable. The clock was a predator, stalking her in the silent room. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind racing, sifting through terabytes of data. She wasn't just looking for files with Vance in the name. She knew they would be hidden far more cleverly than that. She was looking for anomalies, for project codes that didn't fit the standard naming convention, for encrypted files tucked away in seemingly unrelated client folders. It was a test of pure intellectual endurance, a high-stakes puzzle with her father's justice as the prize. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her heart hammered against her ribs. The hum of the laptop's fan was a roaring engine in the quiet room. She followed a trail of deleted email fragments and corrupted data logs, a breadcrumb path left behind by the original cover-up. It was like performing digital archaeology, reconstructing a crime from its fossilized remains. Then, with only 15 minutes left in the maintenance window, she found it. It was a folder, mislabeled as Q3 Marketing Audits Inactive, buried 5 layers deep in an old, forgotten server partition. Inside was not marketing data, but a complete, unredacted shadow ledger of the Vance Innovations takeover. It contained the original, accurate asset valuations, side by side with the falsified numbers that had been submitted in the official filings. It was the Rosetta Stone of the entire fraud, a clear, mathematical record of the crime. But the real prize, the irrefutable proof of intent, was in a subfolder labeled Internal Communications. There she found a chain of emails between a senior partner at Crestview and a young, cocky Julian Sterling. The words on the screen made the air rush from her lungs. Julian's emails were a masterclass in casual cruelty and criminal conspiracy, explicitly instructing the accountants on how to systematically devalue Vance's patents, even mocking the old fool who owned the company for not having better legal protections. The final email in the chain was the one that would become his undoing. In it, Julian laid out his true plan. He detailed the creation of 3 offshore shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands that he secretly controlled. His instructions were clear. After Crestview's fraudulent valuation drove Vance Innovations into bankruptcy, these shell corporations would purchase the company's most valuable patents from the bankruptcy estate for pennies on the dollar. He was not just taking over a company, he was orchestrating a deliberate, fraudulent transfer of assets to himself, stripping the company bare, and stealing its soul before leaving its carcass to rot. Reading the cold, self-satisfied words, Ilara felt a profound, chilling sickness. This was not business. This was theft. This was the blueprint for the destruction of her father's life, written with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he was above the law, above morality, above consequence. She saved everything to an encrypted hard drive, a digital copy of his soul's corruption. The system access window slammed shut at 5 a.m. sharp, kicking her out of the server. She leaned back in the cheap motel chair, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion, adrenaline, and a grief so profound it felt like a physical blow. She had the proof. The smoking gun was not just smoking, it was a cannon, still hot from the blast that had shattered her family. The exhaustion was immense, but beneath it, a new feeling was taking root, the cold, hard certainty of impending victory. She was no longer just a daughter seeking justice for her father. She was the custodian of an undeniable truth, a truth that had the power to dismantle an heir and shake an empire. The fight was no longer a matter of if, but when, and she knew, with an instinct that felt as old as time, that the when had to be perfect. It had to be public. It had to be a stage from which he could never, ever recover. In the days that followed, a new tension filled the air. Julian Sterling, though unaware of the specific breach, was not stupid. The public humiliation at Æthelgard had made him paranoid. He must have felt a subtle shift in the currents of power, a whisper of a threat on the wind. He began to move, clumsily at first, then, with increasing urgency, to shore up his defenses. He put his legal team on high alert, instructing them to deep six any and all records related to the Vance deal. Old partners at Crestview received sudden, menacing phone calls, reminding them of their non-disclosure agreements. He was a man trying to plug a leak in a dam with his bare hands, unaware that the floodwaters had already breached the walls and were silently gathering behind him. His panicked movements were a confirmation to Alara and Finch that he was vulnerable, that he was scared. The predator was beginning to realize that he was now the prey. The final piece of the plan fell into place when Professor Finch received an invitation. As a prominent academic and ethics consultant, he was on the list for the annual Sterling Family Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of New York's philanthropic season. It was an event hosted personally by Arthur Sterling, attended by a veritable who's who of the city's financial and cultural elite, and covered extensively by the national press. It was a night dedicated to celebrating the Sterling family's legacy of public service and generosity. The irony was almost too perfect to be believed. It was the ultimate stage, a temple built to honor the Sterling name. And it was there, in the heart of his family's legacy, surrounded by his peers, and in the full glare of the public spotlight, that Alara would deliver her verdict. The gala was in 1 week. The countdown had begun. Alara spent that week in quiet, intense preparation. She did not pore over legal texts or rehearse her lines. The facts were now a part of her, etched into her memory. Instead, she spent the time steeling herself, transforming herself for the final act. She visited her father every day, sitting by his bedside in the quiet, antiseptic room. She didn't speak of her plan. She simply held his hand, the same hand that had once built brilliant machines, and drew strength from his silent presence. She was no longer the invisible waitress, nor was she simply the grieving daughter. A new identity was being forged in the crucible of her purpose. She was becoming an instrument of justice, a vessel for a truth that had been buried for too long. When she looked at her reflection now, she saw a woman who had walked through fire and emerged, not burned, but tempered. The stage was set, the evidence was secure, and the executioner was ready. The grand ballroom of the New York Plaza was a universe unto itself, a breathtaking galaxy of shimmering gold leaf and soaring marble columns. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 hothouse flowers, their perfume mingling with the expensive fragrances of the city's most powerful inhabitants. Light from colossal crystal chandeliers, each one the size of a small car, fractured into 1,000,000 dazzling points, scattering across diamond necklaces and the polished faces of gold watches. The sound was a carefully orchestrated symphony of power, the murmur of conversations where fortunes were decided, the clinking of champagne flutes filled with Dom Pérignon, and the soft, elegant strains of a string quartet playing Vivaldi. This was the Sterling Family Foundation Gala, an annual spectacle of performative philanthropy, a night where the architects of the modern world gathered to congratulate themselves on their own generosity. It was a stage built for kings, and tonight a ghost had come to haunt it. Alara Vance moved through the glittering crowd, not with the deference of a servant, but with the focused, silent grace of a predator. She wore a simple, dark blue gown, elegant in its austerity, a stark contrast to the sequined and silken creations around her. It was a dress that did not seek attention, yet it could not conceal the new, unshakable authority in her posture or the burning intensity in her eyes. Inside, her heart beat a steady, slow drum against her ribs, a rhythm of pure, cold purpose. She was the calm at the center of a hurricane of her own making, her mind a repository of facts and figures, of emails and spreadsheets, a digital ghost she was about to make terrifyingly real. On the grand, elevated stage at the far end of the room, Julian Sterling was preening, a smug smile plastered on his face as he stood beside his grandfather, soaking in the adulation of the crowd. Arthur Sterling stepped up to the podium, a figure of old-world gravitas in a world of fleeting, flashy wealth. A hush fell over the ballroom as he began to speak, his voice, though aged, still carrying the resonant timbre of command. He spoke of legacy, of the responsibility that came with great fortune, of building something that lasts beyond a single lifetime. His words were a thinly veiled rebuke of his grandson's entire philosophy, a lament for a world where honor was becoming an outdated commodity. Lara watched him, a strange pang of sympathy piercing through her cold resolve. He was a man from another time, a lion in winter, unknowingly presiding over the public collapse of his own dynasty. Professor Finch, standing near the back of the room, caught her eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Elara began to walk forward, her path to the stage as direct and unwavering as an arrow shot from a bow. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd as she moved, a low murmur that grew as people recognized the sheer, audacious implausibility of what was happening. A woman, a complete unknown, was walking toward the stage with an air of absolute purpose, as if she owned it. Julian's eyes scanned the crowd, and when they landed on her, his smug smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending rage. He recognized the waitress, the ghost from Aethelgard. He snarled at the nearest security guard, a thick-necked man in a tight tuxedo, jabbing a finger in her direction. "Stop her! Get her out of here! Now!" But the guards were too slow, and Elara was too determined. As they began to move toward her, a man in the production booth, a young technician who had been one of Professor Finch's most idealistic former students, made his move. A low-level microphone, intended for audience questions, suddenly crackled to life on a small stand near the front of the stage. Lara reached it just as the first guard laid a hand on her arm. Her voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, boomed through the grand ballroom, clear, calm, and utterly commanding. It was a voice that did not ask for permission, but seized authority. "Let go of me," she said, not to the guard, but to the room, to the world. The guard froze, stunned by the sheer force of her will. Julian's face turned a blotchy, furious purple. He looked like a child whose favorite toy had just been taken away. Elara turned her gaze from him and fixed it on the patriarch. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice now softening slightly, resonating with a profound and genuine respect. "You speak of legacy. I would like to speak about the true cost of yours. My name is Elara Vance. I am the daughter of Thomas Vance, the founder, creator, and spirit of a small, brilliant company called Vance Innovations. A company your grandson boasted of destroying as his first great victory. The name, spoken with such raw, powerful clarity, hung in the silent, cavernous space, a single word that contained a universe of pain and injustice. The gasp that swept through the ballroom was a collective, audible shock. The name Vance Innovations, though forgotten by most in the room, still resonated with a few of the older titans of industry, a ghost of a company known for its integrity and its groundbreaking work. The press, corralled in a roped-off section, surged forward, cameras flashing like a sudden lightning storm, their lenses trained on the lone, defiant woman on the stage. Julian was babbling now, shouting that she was a liar, a crazy person, a disgruntled employee trying to extort them. But no one was listening to him. All eyes were on Elara, and on the massive video screens that flanked the stage, which had, until a moment ago, been displaying the benign logo of the Sterling Family Foundation. Now, with a click from the control booth, they flickered and changed. The foundation's logo was replaced by the cold black and white text of an email, its subject line stark and damning. Project Vulture, Vance Innovations Takedown Strategy. The words were Julian's. Arrogant, cruel, and self-satisfied, they detailed the entire fraudulent scheme. From the deliberate undervaluation of assets to the plan to use offshore shell corporations to steal the patents. His own words, his digital soul, were laid bare for the entire world to see, magnified 100 times, a monument to his own greed and corruption. The final email displayed was the most devastating. It was the one where Julian had mocked her father, calling him an old fool who trusted people too easily, a relic who deserved to be swept aside by a new, more ruthless generation. Reading those words magnified on the giant screens, Ilara felt a fresh wave of grief and rage wash over her, but it did not break her, it solidified her. It was the fuel for this final, righteous act. The evidence was not just a collection of data, it was a testimony. It was the story of a good man's life being dismantled for sport by a boy who had never built anything of value himself. The room was a tableau of stunned faces, of open-mouthed shock. The titans of industry, the politicians, the philanthropists, they all saw the raw, ugly truth of how their world was often built on the broken dreams of smaller, better men. Julian Sterling's downfall was not a slow decline. It was a spectacular, instantaneous implosion. He lunged for the microphone, his face a grotesque mask of sweat and terror, and began to scream, "It's all lies, forgeries, she's a nobody, a waitress." He was a cornered animal, lashing out with incoherent, pathetic denials that only served to tighten the noose of his own making. His polished, Ivy League veneer had been sandblasted away, revealing the rotten, hollow core of the man he truly was. Arthur Sterling had not moved. He stood like a statue carved from granite, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the evidence displayed on the screens. He had watched his grandson's entire, pathetic performance, from the initial, arrogant dismissal to the final, desperate meltdown. He had seen the irrefutable proof of a crime that was not just legal, but moral. A crime against the very principles of integrity and creation that he had tried and failed to instill in his heir. When Julian finally sputtered into a whimpering, exhausted silence, Arthur raised a single, trembling hand. The gesture was not one of command, but of profound, weary finality. The entire room, the entire world, it seemed, held its breath. He slowly took the microphone from the podium, his movements heavy with the weight of his decision. He did not look at his grandson. He looked at Ilara, and in his eyes she saw not the anger of a patriarch whose name had been disgraced, but the deep, sorrowful respect of a man who was witnessing a necessary, painful, and absolute form of justice. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, and now he was about to sign its death warrant and its rebirth in the same breath. What was the most satisfying moment of Julian Sterling's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. His voice when he spoke was a low, gravelly whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. For 60 years, he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled elite, I have worked to build a name, the Sterling name, that was synonymous with integrity, with innovation, with honor. I believed that legacy was the most important thing a man could leave behind. Tonight I have learned that I have failed. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, looked directly at his grandson, his eyes devoid of all warmth, all affection, all family. They were the eyes of a judge passing sentence. You, he said, his voice laced with a cold, quiet contempt, are not my legacy. You are my greatest shame. He then pulled out his personal phone. The entire room watched, mesmerized, as he dialed a number and put the call on speaker. The voice of his personal attorney, crisp and professional, filled the room. Arthur, is everything all right? Arthur's reply was swift and brutal. David, he said, I want you to begin the process immediately. Remove Julian Sterling from the board of Sterling Industries. Rescind all his signing authorities. And I want you to rewrite my will. He is to be disinherited. Completely. Every last cent. The sound of 1,000 collective intakes of breath was the only reply. The public execution was complete. Julian Sterling, the heir apparent, the titan in training, had been rendered a ghost, erased from his own story in a matter of seconds. Arthur Sterling ended the call and turned his full attention to Alara. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of profound, weary respect. "My grandson proved that he is not worthy of his name," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound strength. "You, Miss Vance, have shown more character, more courage, and more integrity in the last 10 minutes than he has shown in his entire life." The Sterling fortune was built to create, not to destroy. It was meant to be a force for good in the world, not a weapon for the greedy. He took a step toward her, his old eyes clear and certain. "I am asking you to help me restore its purpose. I am making you the new executive director of the Sterling Family Foundation, effective immediately. And I am instructing my lawyers to draft the paperwork to grant you a controlling interest in Sterling Industries. Use it to right the wrongs. Use it to find and fund all the other Vance innovations out there that are being crushed by the Julians of this world. Start with your family. Rebuild what he broke." The offer was so immense, so reality-altering, that for a moment, Alara could not breathe. It was not a reward. It was a restoration. It was a power so vast it was terrifying, a responsibility that felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried. In that moment, she felt the spirit of her father, a quiet, approving presence, and she knew, with absolute certainty, what she had to do. Months later, the view from the corner office was not of the city's glittering spires, but of the bustling creative energy of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The office itself was not a monument to ego, filled with mahogany and leather, but a functional, light-filled space with whiteboards covered in schematics and financial projections. This was the headquarters of the Vance Sterling Initiative, a new kind of venture capital firm, a foundation with teeth, dedicated to finding and protecting the next generation of innovators. Alara Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. She was no longer defined by her grief or her anger, but by her purpose. She wielded the immense power she had been given, with the same precision and ethical clarity she had used to dismantle Julian Sterling. The initiative had already saved a dozen small, brilliant companies from predatory takeovers, creating a firewall of capital and legal expertise around them. Her father's care was now the best money could buy, and while he would never fully recover, there were moments, fleeting but precious, when a flicker of recognition would return to his eyes. She had not just won a battle, she had changed the rules of the war. She had transformed a legacy of shame into a beacon of hope, ensuring that her father's name, and the principles he stood for, would not just be remembered, but would continue to build a better world. If Alara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.